Sony just wrapped up their tech spec reveal for the PS5, and oh man, what a presentation. Got a couple thoughts on that. Let's focus on two main things though. One, I'm going to talk about the tech specs of the PS5 and how it compares to the Xbox Series X, because we just got those a couple days ago as well, so it's going to be interesting to stack those side by side. And two, I really just want to talk about how Sony's approach to talking about and revealing the PS5 versus Microsoft's approach to the Xbox Series X is very different, and I don't think it's the right idea. First off though, tech specs. So we got a full list of what's going on inside the PS5. We don't actually have a full image of it like we did with the Series X. We don't even know what the PS5 even looks like. But as far as what's on the inside, let's look at each individual part and how that stacks up to what the Series X has going on, starting with the processor. Like the Xbox Series X, the PS5 is going to be making use of an AMD Zen 2 CPU with 8 cores. Where there is a difference, though, is what those cores are clocked at. The PS5 is at 3.5 GHz, while the Xbox Series X is at 3.8 GHz. So that is a slight favor in Xbox's camp. There is one other aspect about this I want to talk about, though, which is the fact that the PS5 CPU has a variable rate, which we'll get to in just a second. Meanwhile, for the GPU, both systems are using a custom RDNA 2 card, which is again AMD. What's interesting about this situation, though, is that PlayStation basically went out of their way during the press conference to try and dispel some of the ways that people are currently talking about graphics cards. Because the big word a lot of people like to throw around right now is teraflops. That's been the main term a lot of people use sometimes when talking about like, oh, well, this card is this strong because it's capable of these many T-flops. And PlayStation basically went out of their way to say, that's not really accurate. That is an aspect of what a card is capable of, but it's not necessarily the sole only important measure of what it can do. The reason they focused on this is because when you look at these two cards on paper, the PlayStation 5 does look like the weaker of the two if you only focus on teraflops. Their card is capable of 10.3, while the Series X is capable of 12. However, if you want to take a more in-depth look, something that could also be more important though, is that while the PS5's card has less computing units, each of those units is at a noticeably higher frequency. Each of the Series X's 52 computing units are clocked at 1.825 GHz, while the PS5's 36 computing units are at 2.23, and again, like with the CPU, is capable of a variable rate. The reason I keep bringing up this concept of variable frequency is because it highlights a very important difference between how the Series X and PS5 are approaching this next generation. The Xbox Series X is a brute force machine. It is at static values for its CPU and GPU and is just all power all the time. Whereas the PS5 is making use of variable frequencies so that the CPU and GPU adjust to what a particular game actually needs. Of course, a lot of this also comes down to how developers choose to leverage this tech, but at the end of the day, it's very interesting to see how these two systems are taking such a different approach. Now, as for RAM, both systems are making use of 16 GB, but something I think is worth highlighting is the difference in memory bandwidth. So the Xbox Series X actually has simultaneously more and less bandwidth than the PS5. And the reason why is because the RAM's actually broken up into two pieces, a 10 GB section and a 6 GB section. The 10 GB is connected with 560 GB per second bandwidth, while the 6 GB is only at 336. By comparison, the entirety of the PS5 16 GB is connected by 448 GB per second. So it's sitting in the middle of those two pools that Xbox Series X has set up. There's a few other specs we can talk about, but I think the only one that's left that's really interesting to really highlight between the two systems is storage. So the Xbox Series X, as we talked about before, has a 1 TB SSD, while the PlayStation 5 is going to have only 825 GB. Now, at the first sound of things, that's like, oh, that sucks, PlayStation has less storage. But something that's really interesting to highlight, another difference between these two, is the I/O throughput, which is basically how the storage communicates with the system. The I/O throughput on the Xbox Series X is capable of 2.4 GB per second, while the PS5's is capable of 5.5 GB, over twice as much. So that means that while they both are fast SSDs, the actual speed at which all that data can be transmitted to the system back and forth is a lot faster on the PS5. Something Xbox did talk about is that they also have their own custom architecture for how the Xbox is talking with the SSD, but at the end of the day, that very noticeable difference in speed is pretty appreciable. However, something that I think is interesting and plays a little more in Xbox's favor is the approach both companies have to expandable storage. So one of the really cool things about the Series X is that they're going to be selling dedicated expandable storage cards that you can plug into the back of the Series X that operate exactly the same as the internal storage. So if you buy one of these expandable 1 TB cards, plug in the back of your Xbox and install a game on there, it will be no different than a game you installed on the regular hard drive. PS5, on the other hand, will offer expandable storage, and it's not going to be any kind of proprietary limit, which is cool, but you have to still buy certain specific SSDs, and even then, those ones are not going to offer the exact same performance as the internal storage of the PS5. So that means that in order to get the best performance possible out of the system, you need to make sure the games you care about that have long loading times are going to be on the PS5's own internal and not that expandable port. It will still be faster than current systems, but not the same speed as what the PS5's internal will be capable of. So that's a lot to digest, I know, and when we're looking at these numbers, it looks like each system is winning in some specific categories. They each have their strengths and advantages. However, I really can't drop the fact that in a lot of ways, I think Sony messed up on this reveal. We've been talking a while now about how PlayStation has been so secretive while Xbox has been very open about their next-gen system. I mean, we got an actual visual look at the system last year, and PS5, just now talking about tech specs, still hasn't shown us the actual model of the system, which is a concept that honestly just appeals a lot easier to a lot of people more than just hearing a lot of numbers rattled off. I'm not saying that these numbers aren't necessarily important, but the approach that PlayStation took, where we have Mark Cerny just going into a very, very in-depth discussion about how the system works, isn't something that sells units. To be honest, I'm not even sure what the actual end goal of this presentation was, because in many ways, a lot of what they were talking about was something that would appeal very heavily to actual game developers. But the thing is, most game developers they're going to be working with for games coming out early on for the PS5 already have dev kits. They already know about a lot of these things. And so really what Sony needs to do right now is get people on board with why their system is cool, and an hour-long presentation breaking down the intricacies of how the hardware works doesn't sound cool. Another huge part of this problem is that this is the first real big reveal we have of any kind for the PS5, and it suffers a lot from the concept of telling, not showing. Xbox didn't spend nearly as much time talking about the tech in depth the way PlayStation has, but what they did do was show us actual load time comparisons between games. We saw games running with ray tracing and how that actually changes things. We saw an Xbox One game running on Series X and how it would improve the performance of that particular game. We have actual examples to look to and go, oh wow, that's cool. Whereas PlayStation doesn't really give us any of that yet. Now, to be fair, there were a couple other things PlayStation talked about at the presentation. In particular, PS5 is going to be supporting backwards compatibility, kind of. It will be able to support a number of specific PS4 games at launch, and much like how Xbox One approached the Xbox 360, more compatibility will open up over time, but that's it. I know there were a lot of rumors about, oh, well, maybe it'll have PS1 or PS2 or PS3. No, not happening, at least not right now. As far as we know from Sony's own official words, we are just getting some select PS4, and that's it for the time being. Another concept they talked about was 3D audio, and this is something they brought up a little bit in the past when they were introducing the PS4 Pro and they were starting to add headsets and they were having some specific games try to start messing with this technology. This is actually something I do find really interesting because there's an argument that when it comes to graphics and certain aspects of gameplay design, we're starting to hit certain limits. Graphics are going to continue to get better, but the leaps and bounds they're going to make are smaller and smaller, and something that hasn't really been expanded on is audio in games. And so the idea of introducing true 3D audio to games you're playing, where if you're wearing a headset and things sound like it would in real life, that's really intriguing and awesome. I think that's super cool. But again, it's a lot of talking. We don't really have any good examples of it yet. And that's a huge area where I think, honestly, Microsoft is starting to get even more momentum on their side. Regardless of what you think about the individual specs of each system and what they're going to be capable of, there's only a handful of people who are going to look at those numbers side by side and go, oh yeah, that's the system I want, definitely, that's the cool one. At the end of the day, the thing that actually convinces someone what system they want to buy is what games are on it, what the games look like on that system. We need to see actual stuff in action and hear a lot of features, and PlayStation hasn't done any of that yet. Of course, there is a lot of time before these systems come out. By anyone's best guess right now, it'll probably be holiday season this year, November, most likely. But of course, there are certain things happening in the world right now that might push that farther back. Regardless of that, the point is that there's still time left for PlayStation to make additional announcements, to have additional presentations that'll actually try and show us what's cool about their next-gen system. I'm sure that's something that is currently in their plans. I just don't think that this first presentation was necessarily the right first step to make. Because as it stands now, we have a honestly boring hour-long conversation about the in-depth tech specs of the PS5 and a lot of really cool actual hands-on demonstrations of the Xbox Series X. And that's not a great situation for Sony to be in. That's at least my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Did you like the PlayStation 5 tech spec reveal? Were you bored by it? Are you still excited for PlayStation 5 regardless? Are you team Xbox? Are you team PlayStation? Have you changed sides? Whatever, let me know down below.